The second case where markets can have difficulties is in the area of what we call externalities. Okay. Now I've got a bullet there that mentions this is when economics becomes more interesting, and yeah, it is interesting talking about externalities because it's one of the first examples of kind of a messy case, right? Everything we've done so far shows how markets work really well. Well, externalities are those certain situations where somebody's economic choices, right, affect somebody else, kind of an innocent third party, okay? So that's why for the definition here I have an externality is the uncompensated impact. Sometimes this is called a spillover effect, right? But it's the uncompensated impact of a person or firm's actions on the well-being of others, right? So there's kind of a third party who's affected, right? So that is, there's some external effect of my economic choice, and that's what we call an externality, right? So this is where I'm a buyer or a seller and I'm making a choice to buy or sell a product or produce a product, and that choice affects somebody who is kind of an innocent bystander, right? So as you can see, we haven't really addressed these issues, right? And so this is what we call externalities, okay? Now there's two types. Positive externalities, that is, this external effect on somebody else has a positive benefit, right? It's helpful for that other person. So we call this a positive externality, okay? Now you'll sometimes see in the book or in other places where you're reading about this, they'll sometimes call it an external benefit, but it basically means the same thing. Positive externality, external benefit. That is, there's some sort of beneficial impact on somebody else, okay? Okay. So some examples of this are research and development and bees. I'll talk about bees in a second. But the idea here of research and development is if I'm doing research, right, if I discover the internet, right, this is long ago, researchers working for the Department of Defense wanted to kind of network or connect together computers that they had at different places around the country, right? And so they put together this network that would connect all these computers, right? This is the beginnings of the internet, right? And so this idea of networking computers, right, these new ideas can then be taken and used by lots of other people, right? So their original idea of networking computers together has this beneficial impact on everybody else, right? The internet clearly has benefited everybody else in all kinds of different ways, right? So that's why research and development is an example of a positive externality, right? The researchers who were originally doing some research to create something aren't taking into account this beneficial thing that's going to affect society, okay? All right, bees. So why are bees an example of a positive externality? Well, bees are a nice example of a positive externality because it's a very simple example and it's easy to kind of visualize and picture, okay? So imagine two farmers who have their orchards. Let's say they're, we're in Florida, so they've got orange orchards, okay? And so Farmer Bob and Farmer Susie, right? They both got farms right next to each other. They've got all their orange trees planted, okay? Well, if you know anything about trees, you know that when trees set their blossoms, when they bloom, those blossoms need to be pollinated, right? And the best person to do that pollination is bees. I guess not really a person, it's an insect, but you get the point, right? So you need to have bees that fly around and pollinate the trees, right? Well, it turns out there's people who will actually supply you with bees. These are called beekeepers, right? And if you've ever driven through farmland and if you've seen these kind of white or grayish colored boxes that are in orchards, those are bee boxes, right? And they have these little honeycombs, I guess you could say, these basically little slides you put in there, and that's where the bees deposit all the honey and stuff like that. So, okay, so let's suppose Farmer Bob is a good, responsible guy, and he wants his bees pollinated, right? And let's suppose Farmer Susie, she's a little lazy, enjoys sitting on her front porch and looking out over her orchard, right? So Bob goes and contacts a beekeeper. The beekeeper brings the boxes of bees, they plop it in his orchard, and the bees fly out and they start pollinating his trees, right? Well, bees are serious violators of private property rights, right? They don't know where Farmer Bob's orchard ends and Farmer Susie's orchard begins, right? They're going to go pollinate any sort of tree, right? So this is an example of a positive externality for Farmer Susie, right? She's sitting on her front porch looking out over her orchard, watching the bees that were paid for by Farmer Bob fly into her orchard and pollinate her trees and give her that benefit, right? So that's why bees are kind of a good, simple example of a positive externality, right? Here's one farmer getting bees to pollinate his trees and is providing a benefit for the farmer next door, okay? Now, because of this, what generally happens in areas where there are farmers that have orchards next to each other is they all pitch in together so that no one's basically freeloading off of the other person's bees, okay? Okay, negative externalities. Well, this is where someone's actions have impose a cost on somebody else, okay? So a negative externality is one where there's a negative or harmful impact on others, okay? So, example here, or the classic example of a negative externality is pollution, right? So if I'm a coal-fired power plant, or not if I'm a coal-fired power plant, if I'm the owner of a coal-fired power plant, right, I am producing I'm using coal, I'm burning it to produce electricity that I can sell to people, right? We need electricity to run hospitals and schools and all kinds of things, right? So I'm engaging in some economic activity. However, one of the byproducts of using coal to produce electricity is there's some pollution given off, right? And so this imposes a negative impact on people who live nearby. Maybe people with asthma, right? The smog and other types of costs, right? Or if it's a type of factory where instead I'm putting pollutants into the water, right? Then this affects people downstream who want to use the water. Maybe it's farmers who want to water their crops, but they can't because there's pollutants in the water. Or maybe it's people downstream who fish, right? And the pollution is killing the fish, right? So this pollution imposes a cost on other people. And so that's why it's kind of a good example of a negative externality, right? And again, the last one here, barking dogs, is again just a simple way to think about negative externalities, right? If you're a dog owner, you have your dog, you've made a choice to get a dog, you love your dog, and that dog provides all sorts of benefits to you, and some costs, right? Because you got to clean up the dog's poop. But suppose you have a neighbor, and suppose your dog is a young puppy and loves to bark all the time, right? Your neighbor, if they get annoyed by the dog barking, is having a cost imposed on them, right? They didn't buy the dog, it wasn't their choice. But yet they're living next door to somebody who's got a barking dog, and it's imposing a cost. It's annoying them, right? So again, that's why it's kind of a simple, easy to understand example of a negative externality. Okay, so let's go through kind of two examples of externalities using our supply and demand framework to kind of think through how we would talk about externalities, okay? All right, so the first example we're going to do is a positive externality, and we're going to do education, okay? So we as, you guys as college students wanted education for various reasons, right? A lot of times, well, all the time, your desire for a college degree is based off of things you're interested in, right? Your own self-interest, right? Maybe there's a certain job you want to do. Maybe you need to help support your family. There's a certain career you want, right? And so you have all kinds of various reasons for wanting a college degree, okay? And so over here on the left with our diagram, we've got a little supply and demand diagram, okay? So notice over here, as I'm trying to select, hopefully I've selected black. I can't see it. Yes, I did. Okay, good. Why is the color palette in black? It's like a dark day for Keynote, I guess. Okay, so, right, we've got price here, we've got quantity here, we've got a typical supply and demand diagram. And our demand curve here, notice how I've got it labeled with private. What that means is that this is the demand of college students for college education that's based on their own desires and hopes and dreams and so forth, based on their own self-interest, okay? Well, our supply curve here, right? These are colleges and universities, right? So colleges and universities. Okay. We are supplying education, and college students, yourselves, you are the demanders of education. You're the one who want to get an education. Okay. So, if this is the case, all right, then in this market, we're going to have an equilibrium supply and quantity of college education, right? And this price here, we'll call it P star, right? This is the tuition you pay. Tuition. Okay. Okay, so it turns out that when people get a college degree, there generally are positive externalities from that, okay? So people with a college degree tend to be better neighbors, right? We tend to be better voters. We tend to be more civic-minded. There's all these other benefits that accrue to society, right? So we don't account, oh, let me switch to a different color. When we're making that choice to go to college, we're not taking into account these other benefits that we're going to give to other people, right? If we were, what we would say is once we get the college degree, to those people who get that benefit, we'd say, well, give me some money, right? I'm giving you this benefit, so compensate me for this, right? But that's not quite the way it works, okay? So if we were to ask society that's getting these benefits, would you want more people to go to college or less? Right? Society would basically say we want more, right? Because society is the one that's getting these benefits. So the way we show this is we basically draw a demand curve that's further out to the right, and we label it with society. That is, when society is getting these positive benefits, they generally would like us to have a higher demand for a college degree, right? Now again, our desire for college is usually based upon our own hopes and dreams and desires, right? Our own self-interest, right? So this is the quantity that society would want. Now, it also means society wants us to pay a higher price, right? So we'll call this price of society, and this is the private one, okay? So that's how we would kind of show society's desires for us to have a higher demand for education. That is, when there's a positive externality, those who are getting the benefits would want people to do more of that action, okay? Okay, so the next slide just kind of has this drawn nicely, but then a couple other points added here, okay? All right, so as I mentioned before, right, our demand curve is labeled here with the word private, okay? But due to the beneficial externality, right, society would prefer this demand curve be shifted out to the right, okay? Okay. So what this means is that without any sort of intervention of society, we could say the market technically is under-providing the amount of education that society would want, right? If society could get together, they would prefer an equilibrium outcome here, right? But we as individuals, when we make our own choices, we prefer this lower equilibrium with less education, right? So society would like to find some way to push our demand curve out here, okay? Okay, so let's think about that. How does society attempt to adjust for a positive externality in this sense? Well, let's think back to chapter 3, right? What's one of the easiest ways to shift a demand curve to the right, which is what we want to do, right? We're trying to shift you guys, your demand curve for higher education out to the right to match up with what society wants, right? So how would society attempt to do this? What's the easiest way to do this? Well, one of the first factors that will shift demand curves is income, right? That is, give college students money, okay? And then that will shift the demand curve to the right. Shift the demand curve to the right. So, how is this done? Well, scholarships, grants, right? Financial aid, right? All those things that many of you are receiving are kind of society's way of trying to compensate for this positive externality. That is to try to shift your demand curve out to the right, which is more in line with what, quote unquote, society wants. Okay. Okay. So now let's switch gears and let's do an example of a negative externality. Okay. So a good example of a negative externality is pollution from a paper mill. So if you've ever been near a paper mill, you'll know what I'm talking about, but it stinks. So a paper mill basically uses lots of water and smushes up trees basically to turn them into paper, right? They got to smash them into pulp to create paper and so forth. And so this process actually generates a fair amount of pollution, right? The air around a paper mill is just nasty. It stinks. I mean, man, I don't know what they're doing in there, but it smells terrible, okay? In addition, because paper mills use so much water, they're always located near rivers, and then when they're done using that water, they spit the water back out into the river, okay? And so in general, they tend to pollute water in rivers, okay? So now let's think about this in terms of our supply and demand framework as we're thinking about pollution generated by a paper mill, the market for paper, and so forth, okay? All right. So we, as the buyers and demanders of paper, right? This is consumers of paper, right? We go to the store, we buy notebooks, we buy printer paper, things like that. We as consumers represent the demand curve here for paper, okay? Now the supply curve here, these are the paper mills. Paper mills, right? The people making and supplying paper, okay? Now, when the paper mill is making paper, they're taking into account what the market demand is, right? And they have their costs, they got to buy wood and so forth to make the paper. But there's a cost that they're not accounting for. And the cost is the effect of pollution, right? This cost is being imposed on people who are downstream. Again, farmers who maybe want to use the water to water their crops, right? So when the paper mill is producing paper, they're not taking into account this negative externality. That is the cost of pollution on others, okay? And so that's why we label their supply curve as S private, right? These are the paper mills producing paper, but leaving out one particular cost, right? Okay, so if society could get together and take into account the concerns of people who are downstream, maybe they're farmers or maybe they're people who fish, right? Society would probably want a lower supply of paper, right? Society would prefer a supply curve that's back here, right? That takes into account that cost of pollution. So society would prefer an equilibrium that's a little lower and with a higher price, okay? As opposed to the original equilibrium, which is down here. We'll call this P private and put a little star there, okay? So, because the paper mill is polluting and imposing a cost on others that's not factored into their decision, society would like to try to find a way to take that cost and bring it back to bear on the paper mills so the paper mills are accounting for all the costs when they produce paper, right? That is the cost they're imposing on other people, okay? All right, so the next slide just kind of has a cleaned up version of this, right? Paper mills, when they're making their choice, right? Without the influence or intervention of society, would prefer an equilibrium lower down here, right? However, if society could get together and convince the paper mill to account for the true cost of pollution, that would push this supply curve to the left, and that is society would prefer an equilibrium with a slightly higher price and a lower quantity of paper, okay? Okay, so society would prefer the paper mill produce less paper because of that negative externality, because of the cost, okay? All right, which means, let me go here. Yeah, let's just jump to here, okay? So what we're dealing with here, let me switch to red, okay, is that in the case, in our first example of a positive externality, right, the market will underprovide, okay, let's see if I could spell provide. Underprovide the efficient quantity. Right. That is, they don't provide as much as society would prefer, right? Now, when it comes to a negative externality, which is what we're doing here, okay? So negative externality right? The market overprovides, right? There's too much paper produced, right? The cost of pollution is not being factored in, right? So the market overprovides. Okay. That is, society would like to attempt to adjust for the negative externality of pollution. That is, they want to put the cost of pollution on the paper mill. Okay. So how do we tend to do this, right? We either do it with taxes or regulations, right? The idea is, okay, so the paper mill is producing paper, but it's also producing pollution, which is imposing a cost on others. So if we impose a tax on the paper mill that's equal to the cost of pollution, then we'll kind of get back to that level that society wants. So I'll jump back over to the slide here, or the graph here, right? That is, you would try to impose a tax that shifts that supply curve to the left, right? You could also do it with regulations, right? Because for the paper mill to comply with the regulations, it's going to be costly, and it has the same effect as a tax, right? So taxes or regulations are typically the way we try to address this issue, right? So if we're talking about coal-fired power plants, a lot of times there's regulations on how much pollution they can emit, right? They have this thing called the scrubber, which is this big huge building that the air goes through to try to scrub out or take out a lot of those pollutants, right? So taxes or regulations is how we try to impose that cost of pollution back onto the producers of pollution, okay? And all of these kind of things, I should say, or all of these approaches are what we call internalizing the externality. That is, taking the cost or benefit of an externality and trying to put it back on the person making the decision, right? In the event of the positive externality, the college education, right? We're trying to take money, that is to signify that benefit of that person getting a college education, and give it to the person who's thinking about getting a college education. In the case of a negative externality, where there's this cost imposed on other people, we're trying to take that cost of the pollution and put it back on the paper mill, so when they're making their choice, they take into account the true cost of their actions, both the cost to produce paper and the cost of pollution on others, okay? So that's how we kind of try to deal with externalities, is we try to internalize the effect. That is, we change the rules so the positive or negative externality is factored into that person's decision, right? And then if that's the case, then markets will work well again, okay?